Today we have a little more interesting of a project. This is a 2008 Kawasaki Vulcan 900. It's a no start issue currently. The customer told me that he bought it, was driving it home, and it started to run really poorly. He said it wouldn't hardly take throttle. It'd get to a little over quarter throttle and it would start cutting out and wouldn't go over a certain mile per hour. Then he got it home. He said he pulled out the fuel pump and checked the filters on the fuel pump and replaced those. Put everything back together, and it has a no start issue now. So we can go ahead and confirm that. Fuel pump sounded like shit right there. As you can see, turn ignition on. FI light comes on. Oil light stays on. We got a neutral light. Kill switch is in the run position. The fuel pump, you heard it prime. I heard the sub throttle adjust too. Let's see what it does. Okay, so obviously it doesn't fire. You can hear it kind of hit a little bit. We already have worked on this bike a little bit, just tested a few things. We actually have a different ECU for it, in case it is the ECU. We did a compression test on it before. I know that each cylinder has over 175 compression, so I'm kind of going to do things a little differently than what I normally do, since I've already tested a few things. But just in case you see me skipping some steps, that's why. But it's not firing. We're going to put a little contact cleaner into the intake and see if it will hit off of that. If it does, we know it's a fuel delivery issue. Doesn't take much. Okay, so we learned a little bit there. It will hit a little bit on contact cleaner, so most likely it is going to be a fuel issue, which is what I anticipated anyways. First thing I'm going to do is get the seat off there, put a charger on the battery so that we can get the battery charged up and know that we have the correct voltage for everything. Before we hook the charger up, let's get a DC voltage reading from the battery before we charge it. Showing 13.14 volts, which is good. I don't know. I was expecting it to be down around 12.6, 12.7 or something like that, but we'll take that. All right, we've got the battery charger hooked up. You see there, orange light, it is charging. We're gonna let that do its thing. The first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna try and pull the codes. It should have some codes stored if there was an issue. However, when we turn the ignition on, the FI light is going out, so there's a chance that it doesn't have any codes, but we'll try and pull those and see. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and pull the codes on this. To do that on this machine, you'll find a yellow wire plugged into a connector here. It will be under this right side cover. What you're gonna do is you're gonna short this to ground pretty much. You just wanna connect to the connector on this yellow wire and then attach it to the negative side of the battery. So we're going to go ahead and connect to the yellow wire. We're going to go ahead and connect to the yellow wire. We're going to turn the ignition on. You want to see the odometer come up, and then you want to tap this 5 times within 2 seconds and then hold it. See the FI light just blinked. That was a long beep. 3 short beeps, so 13. Let's double check that. 1 long beep. 1, 2, 3. 3 short beeps. 1 long beep. 3 short beeps. So that would be 13. And now we can go to the service manual and see what code 13 is. Come over here to the service manual. 13, you can see here 1 long beep, 3 short beeps. Get a copyright. 1 long beep, 3 short beeps. That says inlet air temperature sensor malfunction, wiring open or short. And I can go ahead and tell you right now that that was not stored in the ECU. That's because when I got it here, the airbox was off of it and that sensor was unplugged when I turned the machine on, so it picked that up, and that's why it's throwing that code. So it doesn't look like there's any codes to help us out, which I kind of suspected, considering that fire light shuts off as if everything's normal when you turn the machine on. But I do want to plug in the old ECU, do the same thing, and test it. All right, we're going to do this the same way we did with the other ECU. I'm going to turn the ignition switch on. The lights come on, FI light will shut off, odometer will pop up. Tap this 5 times within 2 seconds and then hold. Then we should wait for the light. 1 long blink. 1, 2, 3, 13. 2, 3, 21. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 51, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 62, 1, 13, so I think we're back at the beginning. Next one should be 21, 1, 2, 1 quick one, 21, okay. So we're back at the beginning now. So I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect this, shut the ignition off. All right, now we have the codes pulled. We can come over here, look at the service manual. Our first code is 13. That's going to be inlet air temperature sensor malfunction, wiring open or short. And that's because we had that sensor unplugged. So that one I'm not even really going to worry about. I'll double check the sensor, but we'll just write by it. Inlet air sensor 21. It's going to be crankshaft sensor malfunction, wiring open or short. That one's interesting. Next one's going to be 51. Ignition coil number 1, wiring open or short. Ignition coil number 1. And then 62 is going to be subthrottle valve actuator malfunction. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 codes here, all for sensors. I'm not really worried about the first one, 13, like I said, because that was caused by having the air box off and that sensor unplugged when we turned the ignition on. So now that we have those, we can go test these sensors and try to find out what's going on. I just want to mention to you guys real quick, just so this bit of information makes it into the video. But this bike was in here a couple days ago, and I was messing with it a little bit, and I found out that the injectors weren't firing. On initial startup, it should prime the engine. I tested everything up here. The injectors were operational and fine, but this is what was happening. There's a white with red wire going into each injector. That is a constant battery power when the ignition is turned on, so they always have 12 volts supply. They open from a ground sent from the ECU. It is actually, there's a blue with red and a blue with green right here, and that's actually what sends the ground to the injectors, and that will complete the circuit and allow them to open and spray the fuel. Obviously you have to have fuel pressure for that to happen, and the injectors have to be clean, you know, so that the fuel can get through. Since the customer has taken apart the fuel pump, and I know the tank was a little dirty on this bike before, I'm gonna go ahead and do a fuel pressure test just to cross that off the list, and then we'll test those sensors that were having issues. To hook up the fuel pressure tester, I'm going to go ahead and take these two 12mm bolts out. That'll allow me to raise up the back of the tank and have a little more room to work on stuff without taking the tank off. I'm going to take that all off here in a little bit anyways, but I want to leave it hooked up to the bike to test the pressure. Alright, we've got the tank undone. I'm going to stick this under there just to prop it up a little bit so we can get down here to the fuel line, which is going to plug into the tank. This connector right in the way. You can probably see it right here. All right, to get that high pressure fuel hose off, there's a red plastic clip. Just pull the fingers out, unclip it, push the fuel hose on just a little bit further, and then you should be able to pull it just like that. Got a rag there to catch some fuel. Shouldn't drop too much. We'll go ahead and get that hose out of the way. All right, we've got the fuel pressure gauge hooked up. Had to use an adapter to get it to work on this, but it should work. So we're going to go ahead and cycle ignition, let the fuel pump prime, and we will see what kind of pressure we're getting. Now, I'm hoping 40 in between 40 and 50 psi, but I'm not expecting that. That's not promising. Looks like we go up to 50 and then we drop pressure. All right, so we went ahead and wrote down our fuel pressure here. We had 15 psi, and then it drops off as soon as you shut the ignition off. It's probably going to be plus or minus a few psi with that tester. I'm not sure that it's extremely accurate, but regardless, 15 psi I don't think is enough, but we'll check and confirm with the service manual. I just wanted to show you these fault codes here. We had 21, the crankshaft sensor. If the crankshaft sensor generates other than 17 signals, the engine stops by itself. Could it be stopping by killing the injectors? Possibly. And then we had 51, ignition coil number 1. If the ignition coil primary winding has failures, no signal, wiring short or open, the ECU shuts off injector number 1 to stop fuel to cylinder number 1, though the engine keeps running. So that, if there was an issue with the ignition coil, it could shut the injector off, which would not send fuel into the intake, which is kind of the issue we're having. And maybe one injector is firing, and that's why it'll kind of start, but not really. It may be firing only on one cylinder. All right, I'm not sure if this will focus enough to where you can see it, but I'm looking in the manual here on the fuel pressure on the high pressure line. Right after ignition switch is on, it should be 44 psi with the fuel pump running. After the pump runs for 3 seconds and stops, it should be 41 psi. With the engine idling, should be 44 psi, and we had it maxed out at 15 psi, and as soon as you shut the key off, that dropped and went away. I believe it did hold 15 psi while it was priming though. Yeah, so it goes up about 17 psi and drops back down. Regardless, that should be, you know, way up here, so that's not nearly enough fuel pressure. Just going to make a note here by the fuel pressure with PSI. I'm going to put an exclamation point. That will let me know that that is wrong. We can go back to that later. The customer has actually already ordered a fuel pump for this just because, like I said, he worked on the other fuel pump and I guess he didn't like how it looked, and obviously the pressure is low, so the pressure regulator may be bad, or it may be filthy filter, and it just can't create the pressure for the fuel it needs. All right, so we know the fuel pump is only building about 15 to 17 psi. It should be around 41 to 44. So we know that we probably need a fuel pump, and the customer actually already has ordered one before I even picked the bike up from him, so I'm not real worried about that, but I did want to confirm that that one needed replaced. We could do a flow test, but I think it just needs replaced. But by the looks of how the fuel was and how filthy the tank was when I first looked in it before we flushed everything, I think it just needs replaced. I'm going to go ahead and bleed the pressured fuel off into this bottle, and then I'm going to pull the tank and start testing the sensors that we have fault codes on and see if we can find the issue for that stuff. The fuel tester disconnected. I'm going to go ahead and pull the tank off. It's pretty simple on this bike. Just take this bolt out, you can pull this cover comes off, and then this is the actual dash is just held in by grommets. Unseat those, unplug it, or you can just leave it dangle, but sometimes if your bars go like this, it'll pinch it and break it, so I wouldn't recommend doing that. I would just disconnect it. And then obviously there's also a fuel tank breather up here, a hose on the top that you'll have to disconnect. Unplug the fuel pump. I believe the fuel pump or the fuel gauge is an electric connector up here too. Took this bolt out and pull that off, set it somewhere where it's not going to get damaged. This you can just lift up right here, pull that grommet off, and there's two on the back. Just work it off like that. To unplug it, just press in that pin, separate it, pull this breather line off. Go ahead and disconnect the fuel pump. We already have the high pressure hose. Ow. We already have the high pressure hose pulled off, so you don't need to worry about it. Slide the tank back off of the rubber grommets. Disconnect. Looks like he's put a resistor in there to do the modification on this. The fuel gauges on these are wonky, and you have to do modification if you want it to work correctly. Get the fuel tank out of the way. Good time to dump it completely out if you have a dirty fuel tank. That one's already been gone through. Make sure the rubber grommets are on there to hold the tank on. And now we can get the ohm meter out and start the real fun shit and diagnose these bad switches, sensors, whatever. All right, guys, so now we're chasing down those codes that we pulled. We had 3 codes. We had 21, 51, 62. 21 is the crankshaft sensor, and that's what we're chasing down right now. The crankshaft sensor on this particular bike is actually a pickup coil, and if you're watching in my previous recent videos I've done, a lot of them were on pickup coils. It's actually located with the stator behind this cover. I've already pulled off the chrome cover that covers this whole side, and then the sprocket cover right here. You have to be careful with these. They do have dowel pins, so they get a little rusted and stuck on there. You just got to gently rock them back and forth to get it off. Clearly you can see that somebody has been in here. Looks like they probably replaced the stator and the pickup coil. Looks like we may uncover some fun stuff here. So after pulling this sprocket cover off, you can see I said somebody replaced the stator and the pickup coil apparently. You can see this ball of harnesses that are just pinched in between this cover on the back side of the sprocket, and I mean there almost has to be a pinched wire in there, so we're gonna have to check all of those. Make sure we have no opens or shorts to ground, because I don't like how all that's. That one goes to the regulator rectifier, which is up there in the front. It comes under and behind here, but I don't believe that they have it routed right, because that should not be pinched that tight behind there. It's probably a short to ground under there or a broken wire if I had to guess. I'm just guessing right now. Obviously we're going to take it apart and confirm that, but that would be causing issues with the pickup coil. It would be causing spark issues. It would be throwing the ECM off because it wouldn't be able to read where the crankshaft was in its rotation. So that can cause all kinds of problems right there. And that one sensor, that's really at the beginning of where everything starts, because your flywheel is here. It's reading the flywheel, picking up. That controls the spark, the ignition timing, parts of fuel injection. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that this is the brain of right here. So if that signal coming from there going to the ECM is bad or shorted to ground or whatever, that can either fry your ECM, it can throw all the other sensors off, it can do all kinds of things. So we need to get this one fixed and then move on to the rest of them, because this may clean up the codes on the other stuff. We don't know. We'll just have to see. The first thing that I'm going to go ahead and do before I move too much stuff is I want to check, this is the pickup coil here, or the crank position sensor, which is what the code was for. Before I move a whole bunch of stuff around here, I do want to unplug this connector and check on the sensor side, not the part that goes to the ECU, the sensor side of the harness, check it for a short to ground. And to do that, I'm going to use the continuity setting, and I'm actually going to use a beep test to I don't know if you can hear that beep, but basically if there's a connection, it beeps. So we're going to test. Look at these connectors, they look okay. We're going to test from each one of these wires to engine ground. We have nothing shorted on the black wire. Test the yellow wire here. No beeps. That's a good sign. It looks like nothing's shorted to ground behind there. So there's a chance that that sensor is okay and we do not need to open this up. So we want to go ahead and check this side of the system, because the problem could be coming from it and then we would have pulled this off for no reason. I do want to get an ohm reading on this sensor itself. So I'm going to change to the ohm setting. Go ahead and check between these two posts. I don't know if you guys can read that, but it looks like it's showing 0.441. I'm not sure if the manual itself, I'm gonna move things around here and see if, I'm not sure if the manual itself, some manuals don't have a test for this sensor. It's basically a peak voltage test or nothing, but usually you can find an ohm or a resistance test for this. Something funky going on here. Alright, so it's holding pretty steady at 0.441. I'm going to move this harness all around, see if that changes anything. Any shorts to ground or pinched in the cases or anything. Doesn't look like it, so we're just going to leave that alone for now. I'm going to test this side for shorts to ground. I'm going to go back to my continuity beep setting. Here beeping. We're going to check the black with yellow. No shorts to ground on that either, so that particular harness appears to be okay all the way up to the ECU. We have not found an issue with it yet. That's not to say that the actual sensor itself inside this housing may be damaged, or it could, well, it had a steady resistance, so I doubt it's got a complete open in it, obviously. But there could be an issue inside there still. There could be an issue with the flywheel, but we're going to go ahead and check continuity between these wires and where they go to the ECM to make sure that there's a consistent connection between the pickup coil to the ECM. Before we move on too far, let's go ahead and write down the results of what we just found out, so we have everything noted and that way we don't have to go back and retest. On the crankshaft sensor, no shorts. Now we're going to check the wires coming from the connector up to the ECU. Check them for any breaks. I put a pin inside here to make it a little easier to test that, because obviously this probe will not go in those small holes. Alright, we're checking the yellow with black coming from the pickup coil plug-in to the ECU. You can see I've got it plugged into the ECU here, yellow with black. I don't know if you can hear that, but it is beeping, so we do have continuity between there and the ECU. Now we need to check the red with black wire. Alright, now we've got it plugged into the red with black wire. We're going to test that. I don't know if you can hear it beeping, but it is beeping. So we have continuity from the red with black also to the ECU. Alright, so we're reading the manual here, and I just want to point out that it says that basically the crankshaft sensor, the only test for it really is to check peak voltage, according to this manual. I believe there should be a resistance reading, but it says the crankshaft have no power source, and when the engine stops, the crankshaft generates no signals. Crank the engine and measure the peak voltage of the crankshaft sensor. So we could do a peak voltage test. I don't have the adapter for that right now, I don't believe. I can probably do that in a little bit. Check the wire for continuity using the diagram, which is what we just did. So the only other test that they say can be done, because there's not a power source that goes to that sensor, it doesn't get power, it sends peak voltage back to the ECU basically. So the only test we could really do is a peak voltage test. Don't have the adapter right now, may do that later. I'm glad to see that there was no shorts to ground or anything like that. That's not to say that the sensor may not be reading and sending peak voltage back, but we can test that later. Now we want to move on to code 51. We're going to do this ignition coil number 1, which would be the front cylinder. And we're going to go through troubleshooting that. Alright, so the first test for ignition coil number 1, we're going to check the in-coil or the ignition coil input voltage at the ECU. So we're going to connect the positive side of the battery to this black lead terminal 35 coming out of the ECU. I've back probed it. And we're going to take the negative side of the meter to the battery negative terminal, which we have done. And then you turn the ignition switch on and you should have battery voltage at the meter. So we've got all that set up. I'm going to flip the ignition switch on. And you can see we have 13.7 volts battery voltage, and then it drops off after the ignition cycles. So that's good. Alright, now we're back probing and testing the ignition coil number 2. Should have battery voltage. And we do. So the input to the ignition coils, or from the ECU, is good. If the reading is out of standard, check the ECU. It's good. If reading is good, remove the fuel tank and check the wiring between the ECU and the primary lead terminals at the ignition coils. So we can do that next. And this thing is dead battery. So we've now tested the red wire, made sure it went all the way to ECU. It does with continuity. There's 12 or battery voltage on each red wire. There's battery voltage on the black and the black with green. So we know the ignition coils are getting voltage from the ECU. And we can also verify here. Looks like we have red, black with green in that order to make sure that they're hooked up correctly. And we have red, black with green, so that is all correct. The connections on these are good.